Now, the number one story of the week, the new numbers from the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey show employees that telework are more engaged than employees that don't. Lots of numbers in the survey improved, even though the government was working through a pandemic. Jeff Neal's former Chief Human Capital Officer at the Department of Homeland Security, Terry Gerton's President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration. Welcome to both of you. Terry, I start with you. What jumped out at you in the FEVS results this week?
Well, Francis, as you said in the intro, the numbers continue to show improvement. That tells me a couple of things. First, that the effort across the government to encourage managers to focus on employee engagement is having an impact. And that really the issues around work-life balance got much better, telework, and that certainly contributed to rising support. But this is Public Service Recognition Week, and so I wanted to point out that it's pretty clear that employees who worked at agencies that have even bigger missions during the pandemic really felt very positively about the impact that they made. And that comes through the scores. And I think that's what we really ought to highlight because they have such a key role in the services and programs that are beginning to drive our national security.
Jeff, what jumped out at you when you looked at these numbers?
Well, Francis, the thing that actually jumped out at me was something in the demographics, and that was that people at the GS 13, 14, and 15 level represent about 20% of the federal workforce, and they represent about 40% of the respondents in the survey this year. The other thing was the number of supervisors who responded. Supervisors make up about 12% of the federal workforce, and they made up I think about 23% of the respondents in the survey. So that makes me think that the survey may have a more optimistic view of how things are going in the federal government than things really are, because people at the higher grade levels and in management roles tend to have more positive views of an organization. So that was the first thing that kind of leapt off the page at me.
What would you do with that as a Chief Human Capital Officer? How would you parse the numbers then, thinking that way about the demographics, Jeff?
I would make certain that in looking at the data that OPM gives me, that I'd look at groups of grade levels and don't just take the overall agency number and say, okay, this is fantastic, I'm going to run with this and declare victory and go home. What they should be doing is looking at the various groups of employees to see how they perceive the agency. In my own experience at DLA was that we found that supervisors and managers just loved the place, and sometimes rank and file employees, were much different in their views. So I think they really need to dig into the data and not just look at top line numbers for the agencies.
Terry, we have spoken on this program a number of times about telework. Jeff and I have talked about it. You and I have. We've talked about it all together. What do you take away from the telework numbers that came out of the FEVS this year?
Well, I think a couple of things. And the numbers show a correlation. And the more that people work, the more engaged they are. But I think it also has an impact on the perspective on leadership, right? Because telework forces leaders and managers to communicate a lot more frequently. And so you see that in some of the numbers about how people feel engaged. Leaders are probably checking in with them not only about health and safety, on a much more regular basis about their work accomplishment. And so as that builds relationships, employee satisfaction goes up. We know that, and we see that in some of the numbers here.
Jeff, as agencies go through these numbers, what should they be doing with them? You talked a moment ago about digging down into them and understanding them for what they potentially really are. How does one go about doing that? How does one go about knowing potentially the unknowable?
Well, the data does include all this demographic information, and to a large degree, it's available to agencies to be able to look at particular geographic locations, to look at different grade levels. So they can do a lot of things to start digging through the data to find out which groups of employees are most satisfied, which groups of employees are least satisfied, and then look at what the data tells them about things they could do. Pretty clearly, the data says that people like telework, and there was a huge benefit of telework. It also showed that federal employees, when there's a challenge, pull together and get focused on the mission, which is what we would expect out of federal workers. But I think that the data also tells us that they wanted a lot more support on IT, for example, and they didn't get that. And as we move forward with telework becoming more and more fixture in the federal government and not something that people will be opposing right and left, we need to make certain that we provide the technological support that they need to be able to work effectively at home, to be able to measure performance of employees at home, and to be able to have them communicating with one another using technology that the agency is enabling or providing for them. So I think that's really important.
Terry, did anything in the numbers surprise you? Was there anything that made you say, I didn't see that coming, I didn't expect that?
You know, there was one surprise that I think is kind of remarkable, and that is where employees reported their perceptions of customer service delivery. You would have expected, with all the upheaval, with shuttered offices, with transition to remote work and loss of workforce, that customer service and citizen satisfaction would have gone down. But it only went from the mid-90s to the mid-80s. And so I think, as Jeff was just mentioning, that's a real test to the impact of engaged and effective federal employees and the connection that they felt with their mission. So they were able to support their citizens, clients, even in a really remarkable and disruptive environment.
Jeff, 30 seconds left. Any surprises to you?
Biggest surprise to me was that 40% of the respondents were GS 13s, 14s, and 15s. That's numbers skewed quite a bit to the high grade levels, and I'd really like to see the numbers for the lower and mid grade levels.
Jeff Neal, Terry Gerton, thanks both very much for coming on the program. Great to have you.
Thanks for having us.